Good afternoon and good evening to all of those joining us from 35, 36 different countries around the world today for our webinar on European universities, an opportunity to understand a unique insight into what life is like at a European university and by association, what living in a Schengen country actually feels and looks like. I'm delighted today to be joined by David Hawkins, who I will introduce more fully in a few moments. But today's webinar is following on from our very successful webinar 3 weeks ago, which David was part of and gave us an opportunity to gain an insight into British and international schools in Schengen countries. So it's with great pleasure that we follow on from that with a deep dive into European universities as a destination, following on from being at one of those European schools. It's been an incredible year over the past 18 months or so in terms of the effect that the pandemic globally has had on educational outcomes for young people. And I think the fact that we're joined by over 100 people today points to one thing and one thing alone, that amongst other priorities in our lives, education for our children and for the students that we look after is right up there as one of our top priorities. And understanding where globally we as parents can find sustainability, stability, continuity for our children in terms of their educational outcomes has got to be a significant priority over the next 2 to 3 years. And so it's my pleasure to introduce David Hawkins, who you will see in front of you, who is the lead university guidance for universities in Europe for Constellation Group. And as you'll see from his biography, a significantly experienced educator as well as advisor. David and I have known each other for a number of years, and so I really appreciate the fact that he's joining us today. The format today will be David walking us through the various stages of what's on offer, what that looks like, how to go about it. I'll then contribute a range of different questions from the attendees and/or questions that I've prepared myself. But David, welcome to the webinar. It's great to see you again. And
thanks, John.
Over to you.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Either those of you here live or those watching back later on. It's nice to have the opportunity to present with you. I'm going to share my screen and just run through some slides in sort of the key features about studying at university in Europe. And then, as I say, we'll have some questions at the end, which I'm sure John will fire all the things I've missed at me at the end. So let me talk through about the options in Europe. I'm going to focus on options taught in English. Clearly, obviously, you can study a degree in many other languages, but it's important I emphasize the fact that there are huge numbers of degree programs taught in Europe, including in the majority non-English speaking countries, where you don't need to know a word of the local language in order to study the degree. Hopefully over the course of the degree you might pick up some, but it's not maybe what a lot of people assume, that, well, if I want to study in the Netherlands I need to speak Dutch, or in Spain I need to speak Spanish. Not necessarily the case. These are the really popular options: Netherlands, Ireland, Spain, Italy and Belgium, for lots of different subject areas. Switzerland with a particular focus on hospitality education, and Central Europe for students looking for more options in medicine and vet medicine. And I'll touch on all of these a little bit later on. But also there are many other options which might be the right fit for a particular student. And we have worked with students over the last year who got offers from 220 different, or more than 220 different universities across 14 countries, including the United States and Canada, Australia and Asian countries. But a lot of people who might just be applying to 6 or 7 universities across 4 or 5 different European countries, because they're looking for that really specific thing that works for those. So huge variety of options. We're talking about studying in Europe right now, and probably for another couple of years. We can't avoid talking about Brexit as an implication of it as well. Depending on passports and residency and legal status and things, it's become quite a complex area to navigate. I don't want to delve into all the nuance of what you do and don't have the rights to do as an individual, depending on things. But just a couple of key points on the legal situation of understanding is worth knowing that there are two different elements in which sort of Brexit and by the wider extension, sort of immigration and passport rules impact. The first one is just access to universities. For the UK and Ireland is absolutely no different than it was before because of the common travel area. But for other nationalities within the EU, there are different rules that would apply. Students can still access the universities. There's no country that says, oh, well, you are from outside the EU, you can't come, but you might fall into a different set of admissions processes, depending on the passport or the residency the student has, and depending on the rules of the country. The second thing that's slightly detached from the access issue are the finances, which is possibly where a lot of people kind of get quite confused about it. Some universities in some countries make no difference between whether you are EU or non-EU. So Germany, for example, Flanders, the Dutch bit of Belgium, and the private universities, the same. So that makes no difference. Other countries will look at passport or residency or passport plus residency as deciding what level of fees students may pay to go to university. And it's also worth noting it's not just the case that it's the fee difference that might change, but also EU or non-EU isn't just you might be paying more, but you might not be able to access a government student loan, for example, the Duro grants in the Netherlands or the SUSI grants in Ireland to pay for some of that kind of stuff. So it is still possible to do this. Brexit doesn't mess anything up sort of one way or the other, but it's going to be different and you need to delve into some of the complexity of working these things out. So passport and residency, if you are first off looking at studying in the Schengen area in Europe, is just something to get your head around. People want to get excited about the university options and look at what's out there, but it's probably worth doing a little bit of time speaking to someone who knows the ins and outs of this. So first of all, working out where might you be able to access at a cheaper rate or an expensive rate, and what are the processes going to be. In very stark terms, there are some countries where the admissions route is completely different depending on whether you would count as EU or non-EU, and your chances of getting into different universities will be much easier in one and harder in the other. So first point of Europe is to understand that kind of stuff. Beyond that, there are some other common themes I want to touch on. I'm going to actually be talking about the European higher education area, which is 48 different university systems, including some outside the EU, outside the Schengen area. So I, again, can't delve into the absolute nuance of every individual area. I don't want to be here for 12 hours doing an hour in the Netherlands, an hour in Ireland, and so on. But some common themes to be aware of. In the whole, when we're talking about studying in Europe, we're talking about a very focused degree. Not often are you going to find options like the American or the Canadian broader liberal arts style options. It's typically, like you might be aware of in the United Kingdom, where you go to university to study a subject you've been admitted to, be that business or engineering or history. There are some liberal arts courses, but on the whole, it's a focused degree. Something I'll touch on a bit more later on, but a really key difference is to understand that the residential experience can be very different. You will find many European universities that do not provide any student accommodation whatsoever. You might make an assumption that that's going to be the case because that might be what you or your family are used to. Well, you could be surprised. So the level of housing support can be quite varied across many European universities. You'll see a term if you start to delve into this called ECTS, the European Credit Transfer System. And this is a way in which degrees are recognized in different parts of Europe and the European higher education area, and it's to do with the length of a degree. So you would see a degree kind of made up of a number of ECTS a year, so that students can theoretically move between universities or they are recognized. There are, broadly speaking, two different types of universities, the applied sciences and the research universities, and I'll touch a bit more on those later on, but it's to do with different ways in which a lot of continental European secondary education systems work. Particularly in the continental Europe, you will find that students are going into different types of secondary school depending on how sort of traditionally academic or technical or vocational they might want to be in their career, and that impacts universities. Degrees will typically be 3 or 4 years long, depending on the country and maybe depending on whether there's an internship or not. There's a very significant difference in the European universities between the traditions of getting in versus staying in. Typically in English-speaking, as well, an Anglo-Saxon university system, we tend to set the bar quite high from that transition high school into university. So we'll be used in the UK of having high entry requirements and very few people being admitted to the most selected universities, but then once you're in, you are in. In a lot of continental European universities, the bar to get in can be relatively quite low, but then to stay in will involve students getting potentially very high marks, maybe 80, 85% in year one in order to stay in. And then the last one is to understand that we have very different application systems. There are a couple of other countries that mimic the US and the UK where we have sort of centralized systems. A lot of places, though, the expectation is that students are applying directly to universities. And again, the nuance of how it works in different countries is important. Let me explore some of these in a little bit more detail because it's really crucial to understand. I mentioned these two different types of university we tend to see. They're called different things in different countries. So you might see something called a Hogeschool in the Netherlands, or a Hochschule in Germany, or an Institute of Technology in Ireland. And what would historically might have been referred to as a polytechnic university in the UK is I group them as universities of applied sciences. So across most of Europe, what you will find is two different types of public university. The research universities are the ones that most people have in their minds when they think about going to university. It's that traditional academic bachelor's degree where you go to lectures, you do labs, you do maths projects, you write essays and answer things in exams, and you are getting that kind of theoretical educational experience. It's a 3-year bachelor's typically taught by people who have got their PhDs and are professors. Typically answering questions that start with why. Why do these chemicals react in a certain way? Why did Napoleon invade Russia? Why does this author create this character in a certain way? We also, however, have the applied sciences, which aren't so much about why, but about how. How do I launch a new product to market? How do I manage my team effectively? How do I help this athlete get better at running 100 meters? How do I become a better painter? And these are more professional higher education. Normally with a mandatory internship, hence it's a 4-year bachelor's, and you're likely to be taught by working professionals. Now, across most of the continental European systems, these have parity of esteem. There's not maybe that old historic snobbishness that the UK had about this sort of professional, technical higher education. And it's not as if these are without any academic merit. These are rigorous degrees. They're just teaching people in a different way. They can also lead on to master's degrees and lead on to PhDs in due course as well. But worth knowing that just because something is called a university doesn't necessarily mean it might be offering the same experience as another one down the road. It depends on the category it falls into. Within that as well, we have different types of universities in terms of what they've chosen to focus on. Here in the UK and in other parts of the world, we typically have a lot of comprehensive universities, where you have a students doing a range of different subjects. A student might be studying history, the person living on one side of them is doing biology, the person on the other side of them is doing engineering, they play in the orchestra with people doing classics and modern languages and all sorts of different things. We have some specialised universities, sort of art schools and music schools and drama schools, but in Europe we tend to find many more specialised universities in quite niche areas. For example, a lot of business schools, places like Bocconi in Milan, one of the world's best economics and management university, St. Gallen Business School. We have specialist hospitality schools, specialist engineering schools, for example, the Carl Benz School in Karlsruhe in Germany, specialising in automotive engineering. And again, it's going to be a different experience that students might need to choose. If you're going to go to a really specialised university, maybe they're only offering one undergraduate degree. So a European business school, for example, like Neoma in France, has a Bachelor of Business Administration. Now, there may be a couple of 100 undergraduates on there, but maybe thousands of people doing their Masters in Management, Masters in Finance, and then people later on doing their MBAs. That's going to change the focus of the university. If it's mostly about educating 25 to 40-year-olds, the social life will be quite different. The level of accommodation that a university feels has to provide are going to be different as well. So different choices students need to understand in a very basic way. If you're going to a really focused, high-intensity business school, You're not getting away with wearing flip-flops and ripped jeans to go to a lecture. It will be business dress, which may not be what students were necessarily assuming. Another key factor to understand when we're looking at Europe is the level of English, both within and in the environs of the university. If a university is only offering, say, 1 or 2 courses taught in English, that's very different from going to university where everything happens in English. I'll give you 2 examples. There are public universities in Madrid, which are very cheap, which are operating all in Spanish, apart from maybe 1 or 2 degrees, maybe an engineering degree and maybe a business degree. Now that is still, to all intents and purposes, a Spanish university with a couple of English courses. The university is still in effect operating in Spanish. So the administration of the university, how you pay your fees and deal with the accreditation of your degree and get help with registering for a doctor and things is all going to be happening in Spanish. And the area around the university isn't going to be set up for English speakers. So you won't find the coffee shops and the bars and those kind of things are not necessarily going to cater to an English speaker. Whereas also in Madrid, you have a couple of international universities, IE University, for example, and CIS there as well, where they are English language universities that happen to be in a non-English country, where everything happens in English as well. All the degrees are taught in English, and therefore all the help you would get and the community nearby is set up to help people who maybe don't have the level of language. And this is replicated in cities all over Europe, that a student might want to go to a university where they're going to be forced to be immersed in that language and get up to speed pretty quickly. But a student might want that softer landing where they can pick up the language if they need to, but they're not going to have to. And so studying business at one European university and studying it at another isn't going to be the same experience, even if the course content may be very similar, because how widely English is spoken at the university can change things quite significantly. Let me then delve into some of the more popular options of some of the issues to deal with as well, and the ones that students tend to want to go to, and then we'll have some time for some questions at the end. You'll notice, and maybe able to guess from the photo on the screen, that Ireland is one of them, but let me start first of all with the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a really great example of opportunities. It's actually the most popular place for people to study in English in Europe. Certainly now take the UK out of it, even more popular than Ireland, despite the Netherlands not being officially an English-speaking country. But if anyone's ever spent any time in the Netherlands, you'll realise that everybody there speaks English. It's very hard actually to pick up Dutch at all. The Netherlands does have those applied sciences universities, as I mentioned. It also has the research universities. It actually also has a third type of university as well, called the university colleges. The university colleges are sort of spin-offs of the research universities, which do offer the residential experience that you wouldn't necessarily get at the other 2 types of Dutch universities. They are kind of campuses with accommodation. And they actually do offer the liberal arts and sciences like you'd find in the United States. So quite a popular options there as well. The Netherlands is the best example of this idea of selection after the gate, not selection at the gate from high school into university, but selection from year 1 into year 2. And that can sometimes trick families who are used to judging the quality of a university based on the grades needed to get into, because there are many Dutch universities which are in the world top 200, where a student just passing an IB diploma or just getting 3 Cs at A-level can get into that university. So sometimes someone used to the UK, well, how can that university be any good? Well, that 3 Cs or that IB diploma might get you in, but then you've got to hit a high mark at year 1 to stay in. The selection pathways, however, are going to depend on students' equivalency to what a Dutch student would have done. And so there can sometimes be some eligibility issues in terms of subject areas to come into it. Something really important to be aware of with European universities, and I'll touch on this a bit more in a minute. But we can't assume that because a degree is entitled something in the UK, it's the same with the same title elsewhere. And one of the big issues with the Netherlands is business. Students studying business at a UK university typically wouldn't be expected to present with maths at IB high level or A level. Student applying to business in the Netherlands, particularly at the research universities, will be expected to have maths, A level and a good level of IB maths. And it's not a case of, well, I've got 3 A stars, well, that compensates. If you don't have it, you're not eligible, because it's about a government mandated equivalency to a thing that gives you a right to access university. It's not like it would be in the UK or the US, where the universities have a bit more flexibility about what they can choose to do. It's a computer says no moment. You either have it or you don't. Ireland is the other key place that is growing, and students are very interested in studying there. If you are familiar with the UK experience, it's worth remembering that Irish universities are the ancient universities of the British Isles. You look at the history of places like University College Cork, Trinity College in Dublin, they are very similar histories to St Andrews in Edinburgh and Glasgow, because at the time they were founded, they were part of the United Kingdom. So wonderful experiences for students to understand and recognisably feel like a UK university experience, with just maybe a few differences. This, however, is where the passport and the residency can make a big difference, because you have two almost completely distinct admissions processes, depending on whether the student is EU and UK or non-EU and UK. A student who is EU is going to have to go through a thing called the CAO, which is actually not an admissions process at all. It's a matching procedure, where a university has X number of spots and it awards those X number of spots to the students with the highest number of Irish Leaving Certificate points. A completely different way of doing university, but imagine that Oxford said, we will take the people who get the highest marks in their A-levels. Our cutoff might be 600, and if you got 599, you don't get in that year. So it's a very different culture. But if you are non-EU, you just apply directly to the universities, and you can find, to be honest, the admissions rates can be very different. There are some courses at Irish universities where a 45 out of 45 on the IB is actually not enough to get in. Well, what do you do? Well, you don't go. That same course for a non-EU applicant could be sitting at a 32 out of 45 on the IB. So a very, very stark difference. And like with the Netherlands, a massive range of courses at the academic and professional levels. It's not a massive education sector, only 9 universities, soon to be 10. You might not find 30 options in the subject area you want to, but because of wanting to cater to all Irish students, there does tend to be a couple of courses in almost every subject area divided around the country. Another option to bear in mind is the private European universities, and these are the ones which are increasingly popular with students at, for example, UK boarding schools. This is a photo of the brand new, about to open campus of IE University, which I mentioned in Madrid. They've actually built a new skyscraper in the centre of Madrid here. You can see, obviously, it's not quite finished yet. But those private European universities, which, similar to private schools in Europe and the UK, are offering a slightly more well-resourced product. So you might not find at a public university that have accommodation, or the private European universities will. The class sizes will be smaller. There will be more of a consumer focus on treating the parents in the way they would hopefully want to be responded to for emails and well-being issues and things. And these universities do very well. I use a great example of it, but I mentioned Bocconi in Milan, Jacobs in Bremen, lots of the sort of French business and economics schools, other places in Italy as well, and into Central and Eastern Europe. But similar to state school versus private school at secondary level, public university versus private university at the higher education level can mean that you are getting probably a higher level of resourcing and higher touch points for students. And places like IE are very popular. In fact, IE is in the top 5 non-UK university destinations for students from UK independent schools, up there with places like NYU and UCLA. If you are, however, looking for that slightly more cheaper product and the residency thing is, you can look at the public universities. The public universities are wonderful, but you have to go in with your eyes open. This is KU Leuven in the wonderful Belgian Flemish town of Leuven. World-class university, actually tops into the world top 50 on the QS rankings, with 5 degrees all taught in English. Amazing place to be a student. It's where Stella Artois is brewed, so you can imagine what fun the students will have there. And that university will take students with 3 Cs. But students going to a public university like this need to understand that the university's job is to teach you. You turn up, there are lectures, and then everything else is up to you. If you're familiar with a lot of how the secondary education systems work at public high schools in Germany and the Netherlands and places where students might be at school at 7:30 in the morning, but they're done by midday, because the afternoon is when they go and join their orchestra or their soccer clubs or do whatever they're doing. The university system is the same. Don't expect a university like KU Leuven, which is going to cost you as an EU citizen about €900 tuition a year. Don't expect to be sitting down with the professor discussing that piece of work that you've done. The professor's not paid enough money to do that. Don't expect to be in a class with 12 people. There might be 300 in a lecture hall. Don't expect them to have accommodation and a music society and a soccer team and those kind of things. The universities are great and they're very easy to access, but that other stuff beyond just going and getting the education is up to the student to do. Some of the universities will have international offices which try and create those kind of things, but worth knowing that you're not going to be getting a contact from KU Leuven saying, here's your dorm, which one do you want to go into? If you don't get that organised yourself, you probably won't have anywhere to live and might find actually quite a long commute if you get it too late. I'll also flag up, if you are looking at the public university options, there are just some glitches that can cause problems for international applicants coming into them. And this is again because the systems are designed for the students from that country. So it makes sense assuming you are at the high schools in that country. For example, when do the results have to be submitted by? When do you need to have your school leaving qualification? A lot of Scandinavian countries, that's quite early, normally the first week of July. Quite often I get contacted by an advisor, a counsellor at a school saying, we're really confused, we've got a child doing A-levels, they want to go to university in Denmark and they're being told that they have to have their A-level results by the first week in July. But well, they do have to have their A-level results by the first week of July. A-level results don't come out till August. Well, yeah, tough luck, I'm afraid. That's what the gap year is for. And it's just, again, an issue of some Scandinavian countries, you cannot go straight from A-levels into those universities because the timeline doesn't work. You've also got some other countries, and here mostly it's Germany and Switzerland to be aware of, where in order to become eligible for those universities, it's a little more complex than just having the fairly obvious subjects like I've done maths and physics for engineering, or I've done history and politics for law. You actually need to have not what makes sense in the country you've done those qualifications, but actually what you would have got had you gone to high school in the country that the university is in. Germany and Switzerland are really problematic because what they insist on students having for their public universities are not actually combinations a lot of A-level students would typically take. To go to universities in those countries for most things in the public sphere, you would need to have maths or one of the traditional sciences, a language, normally a first language, possibly a second language as well, and then one of the traditional humanities. Now, someone may be taking physics, history, English literature, and French is not the most usual combination. Then that can be a real problem with eligibility. And again, sometimes we have families who are saying, well, my child's got A star, A star, A star in maths, physics, and chemistry. Why can't they study engineering in Germany? Well, I'm afraid they can't. If they had E in maths, history, German, and French, they could do. And so it's a different kind of way in which the works of eligibility versus admissibility in there. And also worth noting, in some countries, particularly places more in Central and Eastern Europe, there is a process whereby your results have to kind of pass through an embassy to be legalized, notarized, or homologated in order to then have the piece of paper that enables you to access university. So the public sphere is a little complicated. A few more options to be aware of in Europe. There's a wonderful suite of American universities abroad, all over Europe, which are accredited as if they were in the US, accredited by the same bodies that accredit NYU and Harvard and Princeton and places. They just happen to be in Europe. So places like the American University of Paris, John Cabot in Rome, or Franklin University in Switzerland, where you can get that American university experience, but have it in Europe. And if you're attracted to that option, but you don't want your child to be in America or don't want to pay the fees of America, then those options as well. If you have a child who really wants to go into the world of high-powered hospitality management, not waiting tables or standing behind a bar, but running 5-star luxury hotels and super yachts and doing private banking, then there's amazing hospitality education across Europe. Switzerland being the obvious place. This is a photo here of students at École Hôtelière de Lausanne. Other Swiss hospitality schools like Lyon and La Roche, and also interesting ones in the Netherlands and France and Ireland, with a completely different idea of teaching and learning. If you go to a university like EHL, in your first year, there is a cafe in the middle of the campus. In the first year, students have to run the cafe, and in their halls of residence, the students are paired off and they clean each other's bathroom from their first period of time. So just a completely different idea of what university education is about. Because of the European higher education area working together, we also have an increasing number of 2+2 options, where maybe a 4-year bachelor's degree is sandwiched in half, and where you can actually study across a number of different European universities, so you can move through Europe. ESCP, the world's oldest business school, has a multi-campus approach where you spend 3 years in 3 different European countries. University College Leuven-Limburg also has a similar program. It's slightly less sexier because you end up in Coventry. There are also 2+2 options with Europe and outside of Europe. So, for example, Sciences Po in France has options where you can study in the UK, USA, Australia, Trinity Dublin, where you can also go to Columbia. Creighton University is a wonderful option where you go to Nebraska in the United States for their summer. And then when it gets cold, you pop off to Australia or the Dominican Republic to a partner university when it's a little bit warmer. So all sorts of pathway options there as well. And last but by no means least, with medicine, health sciences, vet medicine, dentistry being so competitive in all sorts of other places around the world, increasing numbers of students are looking to study those subjects in Europe as well. Typically 2 different ways in which students are doing it. There are options like, for example, the Barts Queen Mary University of London option in Malta, where it's taught in English. So that bit's fine, but the country also runs their medical system in English as well. A lot of students will, though, look at places like the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Bulgaria, where the medical degree is similarly taught completely in English, but the medical system does not function in English. So as well as doing a medical degree, which is still rigorous and still hard, you're also having to become fluent in the language of the country so you can speak to your patients after 3 years. So different options there as well. I said I was going to just cover the key themes. If you have more you want to know about particular countries, I'll point you to our podcast, the University Guide podcast on Spotify and stuff, where, for example, here we have an episode on studying in Germany, where I interview people typically working in the sector in that country, and we delve into some of the nuance of that stuff as well. So, John, hopefully that was a good overview, and I'll take any questions that you think I've forgotten to answer.
Thank you, David. That's an amazing overview in about 30 minutes of all aspects of European universities. And it certainly made me think very seriously about adding this as an incredibly exciting further option globally for international families. And it's quite interesting because since the first pandemic, the research is suggesting that up to 1/3 of high net worth families globally will be seeking some form of second passport or second citizenship. And much of that is driven by providing their children with the best educational opportunities they can find them. And so with that in mind, David, and clearly this webinar is not just about providing insight into the process, but hopefully down the line, getting those children and those students into the universities. If a family were to approach us and to seek our services, what sorts of timeframes would you expect them to be coming to us? And what sorts of key bits of information would they need to come armed with as well?
It's something that I think is important if you are thinking about kind of relocating into a different secondary school system in order to access European higher education, is to deal with that kind of legal residency passport issue to start with, and make sure that your onward plans are going to work. It would be horrible to find out that you thought you were going to come to a particular place because it would give you eligibility for cheaper university fees, and you've got that wrong. Or, like I mentioned with Germany and Switzerland, to make sure you're in a curriculum that does allow legal access into those universities. So whenever students are starting to make those sort of choices for their final 2 years of secondary education, that would be an important thing to understand. But also knowing that some places, for example, Ireland, would require 3 years of residency in the EEA, as well as the EEA passport in order to get the lower fees. So around 13, 14, 15 years of age, maybe for an initial discussion. Some European university timelines are actually significantly later. You just mentioned medicine. Students who want to study medicine in Italy taught in English sit an exam in September, which gives them entry to start medical school a month later. So the actual process could be quite late, but making sure you've actually dealt with the legalities and the residence and the curriculum issues is something to sort out, I say, between sort of ages of 14 to 16.
Great, thanks, David. And for many families, they might be coming to this decision quite late in the day because of events globally over the past 18 months or so. If a child hasn't been studying in, say, an A-level school or a school internationally that does IB, in the UK, clearly we have pathway provision and we have international year one. But for European universities, if an international family doesn't have recognized qualifications, what's in place for them that they could potentially access that would allow them to get onto an undergraduate or a bachelor's course in the normal way?
Yeah, so this is where that eligibility factor for the public universities becomes quite a problem, because if you just don't have the right bits of paper, you don't have the right bits of paper. It's quite often a problem for students maybe coming from the US curriculum system, whereby you just wouldn't have necessarily got the right bits of paperwork. And we quite often get emails from families saying, my child is qualifying from American high school without any APs, where can they go? And the answer is nowhere. In the public sector, you don't have anything that equates to what the student in the country will have done. This is where you end up with the private universities being quite helpful, because they are slightly outside of that public sphere, so there can be a bit more flexibility. The American universities abroad tend, however, to be the homes for those kind of students in Europe, because they are enabling the students to use a US kind of admissions process, which is less focused on grades and more on application essays and references and things. There aren't really foundation pathways in most options. The only one that really is potentially an option is what's called Studienkolleg in Germany, which is where you go for a year and convert what you've got into a German Abitur, their school leaving qualification. Those happen in Germany. Or Ireland has a thing called PLC courses, post-leaving cert courses, which do give that kind of stuff. Those are quite complex options to navigate, really. So it's a case of forewarned is forearmed. Get the student into the right qualification if possible.
Thanks, David. And in terms of the relationships between the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, clearly they're often seen as the gold standard in terms of higher education, but we know that within Europe there are some outstanding universities. At the end of the day, it often comes down to outcomes. Where do the graduates go on to study further education? Where do they go in terms of employability? Can you just give us a sense of, if you were to graduate from a European university, what are your life chances and your employability as a result of going to a European university? Because I think it's very much misunderstood at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of that depends on kind of where the student wants to then go back to as part of it. I mean, if the student is typically going to stay and work in Europe, then normally actually they would go on to do master's study as a matter of course. That's culturally much more of the situation. And a lot of that, not in every, but in a lot of European countries, they don't have the same hierarchical sense of the quality of a university being kind of like a badge that's attached to that person forever, as a lot of Anglo-Saxon university systems have. There's very flat egalitarian societies in many of these countries. And so, if you were, say, from Utrecht, in most cases, you wouldn't necessarily think about going across the country to another university. You're just going to go to the University of Utrecht because it's as good as anywhere else. So this idea of like there being better or worse universities is quite challenging. Students will tend to then build their network whilst they're at university. If they're looking to have a go back to a home country, then it's worth just speaking to the university about the options that they have. I've certainly worked with students who've gone to some of the Dutch universities who've then come back and done really impressive graduate programs in the UK or indeed on to the US, similarly for some of the private universities. But it's a different culture you've got to get your head around. And you've heard me talk about this a lot before, about football versus football, that we use the word university interchangeably to describe different things. Well, think of the word football as a sort of a point to remember here. You wouldn't turn up in America to play football with a round ball and without protection. You've got to learn a lot about the different things that they mean when they refer to football. Well, a Dutch person or a German person, an Italian person talks about university and careers and job prospects. It works on such a culturally different basis to what we might assume in the UK or American and Canadian option. So it's just worth getting your head around that by speaking to the universities.
Thanks, David. And you and I, you've had experience of working in Brussels. I'm a governor at the British School of Brussels, and for many of the attendees on the webinar today, their jobs in the coming months will be to go to their families and their clients and to sell the benefits of a European school or a European university. Now, you've talked about places such as Leuven and Utrecht. I mean, can you just give us a little bit more detail about how international are these locations and what, in terms of internationalism, is the experience for the students? Because the tendency is to think of European universities as maybe being somewhat parochial, but in fact, the reality is somewhat very different.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly in the sort of micro sense of it, the fact that borders are just more porous in non-COVID times, but more porous across continental Europe, means that people are just moving around much more easily. And you'll find people who are actually linguistically much more competent than, unfortunately, us Brits tend to be. So in terms of just a micro sense of just the community of the countries, and I lived in Belgium, as you know, for a couple of years, and for very obvious reasons, because of the geography, if I wanted to go maybe travel from one side of Belgium to another, I would pop through France because it was just the obvious way to go. And so that internationalism, just in terms of the people who were there, makes a difference. What you're going to find, though, in a lot of the universities, the more well-known European ones, like the Netherlands or some of the big kind of business schools, you're going to find that they are bringing in people from all over the world. The Dutch universities are unbelievably popular with people from all over the world. If you are attending an international school anywhere in the world, typically you'll find that the top sort of 5 destinations are the UK, the US, Canada, the Netherlands, and then wherever is good nearby where your country is. The Netherlands has come up from nowhere to really being that option. So you're going to find students from all around the world. And then these private universities, EHL, Bocconi, IE, are drawing people from all over the world to come. That is sort of the attraction for the local students going there as well. So the diverse experience is definitely there. However, if you're going to go to a public university in a 2nd or 3rd tier city in France or Italy or Spain, you will not find that internationally diverse experience there as well. So again, it's to do with the research to get good choices, but it depends on the student. If the student wants to become fluent in Spanish, then going to Bilbao to a university that offers 1 degree is potentially going to work for you, and you might pick up some Basque as well. If you want to do a different experience than the big capital city private university, might be the right one.
Thanks, David. And just finally, David, can you just give us a sense of, throughout the pandemic, clearly there was a lot of disruption within the higher education landscape around the world. How well did European universities fare in that continuity and that consistency of experience for the international students, or those that couldn't attend on campus?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down, and it's actually a good window into that public versus private difference I was talking about earlier. And again, if you look at it within secondary education systems here in the UK, private schools had more money and more resourcing, and they were typically able to offer a better level of continuity than the state school was going to. And that is going to be mirrored within the university sectors across Europe as well. The private universities had the tech and the money and the resourcing to be able to pivot to online. Public universities were less able to do so, and they were a bit hamstrung, I'm afraid, by the government rules and regulations, because they have to abide to those kind of things. So that does create challenges. I think everybody did their best. It's a bit complex for some of the public universities, and particularly if they don't have almost like a duty of care over students because they're not living with them. That did get quite complicated for a lot of students there. Whereas the private universities are a different kind of element. Now, I'm not doing down the public universities, but the difference between paying 900 euros tuition and 22,000 euros tuition does come with what the university is and isn't able to do with that money.
Great, thanks, David. So thank you very much, David, for your insights. That's fascinating and incredibly detailed. And I'm sure for everyone attending today, that's given them a tremendous insight into what's on offer and what the opportunities are. We will be following this up at some point over the next 2 to 3 months with maybe a little bit more of a focus on a smaller number of universities and what that experience looks like for the actual students themselves. But if you are interested in further information, then please do get in touch with myself or David at the following email address. You will be receiving a recording of this webinar for your own information, and if you want to distribute that to any of your clients, please do so. But as David has mentioned, timing is of the essence. If you are serious about schools and or universities in Schengen countries, then obviously that immigration piece is important, but also preparing yourself and your children to have the right documentation, the right qualifications is of paramount importance. But we're here to give you that consultancy and that advice and that guidance. And if you would like to have an initial chat, please do get in touch, and we can assure you of a high quality service, and you will certainly come away, which is something that all parents ultimately want, with a good understanding of what your options are. It may not be where you end up, but as long as you know what you can and you can't do, then that puts you in a position of strength. And that's really what we are hoping to provide for families. And to David, I'm hugely grateful for your insight and your explanations today. And on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for that. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll be in touch soon with further details. Stay safe, enjoy the rest of the summer vacation wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you hopefully in the new academic year. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, David.